From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Millington. I'm the Librarian of Congress, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here to the library's 2009 National Book Festival, the 9th annual one. This is a particularly great event, and history and biography is invariably one of the most popular and crowded pavilions. So we're all glad you're here today. We've kept the rain away so far, and it's just a great thrill to be here and to present the talented speaker and author James L. Swanson, who shares Abraham Lincoln's birthday every February 12th. His bestseller, Manhunt, the 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer, is currently being made into a motion picture. This year, Mr. Swanson will tell us about his Chasing Lincoln's Killer, another version of this compelling story, written and published this time especially for young people. Mr. Swanson has long studied Lincoln. He's written about the Constitution, popular culture, other topics for a variety of distinguished publications, and he's now, he tells me, working on a book that will also take up Jefferson Davis and Lincoln's funeral. So it's a pleasure to present to you the true authority on this important era, and a very welcome participant here in this, the bicentennial year of Lincoln's birth. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. James L. Swanson.
Thank you, Dr. Billington, for that kind introduction. One of the great pleasures of the book festival is that it's hosted by Dr. Billington in such a wonderful, graceful way. Only the Library of Congress could do this, and the library does such a wonderful job. Well, I thought I'd talk about a few things today, and one thing I won't do is read from the book. I assume most of you have probably read it already, and when I go to author events, I always find it a little boring if the author just gets up and reads from the book, because I figure I could do that at home. Why do I want to come out and hear him do it? So I thought I'd talk a little bit instead about why I did this book, how I came to do it, and what lessons I hope the book contains for young people, and some of the experiences I had with young people while working on the book, because this is my first young adult book. And so it was a new experience for me to do it. I became interested in the story, as Dr. Billington said, really the day I was born. I was born on February 12th, Lincoln's birthday, and I was born in Illinois, Lincoln country. We in Illinois don't credit Kentucky or Indiana, because he left those places very quickly and came to Illinois. And so when I was growing up, my parents took me to the great Lincoln sites, Lincoln's home in Springfield, the pioneer village of New Salem, where he was a postmaster, and also to the museums that had wonderful Lincoln things. For example, the Chicago Historical Society has a wonderful Lincoln collection. And I remember as a boy visiting that library and museum and looking at a recreation of the room at the Peterson House in Washington where Lincoln had died. And in fact, the bed on which President Lincoln died is actually in Chicago at the Historical Society, and I remember being fascinated by that sad artifact, even when I was a child. What really got me interested in studying the Lincoln assassination was a gift that my grandmother, Elizabeth, gave me when I was 10 years old. She was a veteran of the old tabloid age of the Chicago newspapers, that Ben Hecht era of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And my grandfather was a member of the Chicago police force from the time of Al Capone and the gangsters all the way through the 1960s and the protests. And they would tell me wonderful stories about Chicago history and crime. And when I was 10, my grandmother gave me as a gift, not a bicycle, not a baseball mitt or a bat, she gave me a framed engraving of the Derringer pistol that John Wilkes Booth used to assassinate the president. And you might find that to be an odd gift for a child, but I didn't. And framed with that engraving was part of a clipping from the Chicago Tribune from the morning of April 15th, 1865, the morning that Lincoln died. And I hung that on my bedroom wall, and I must have read that story 200 times. The president shot, John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, leaps to the stage, makes his escape, and at mid-sentence, that story ended because someone had cut the clipping off in mid-sentence. And I remember as a boy saying to myself, I've got to read the rest of this story. I have to know what happened. And so I'm absolutely convinced that it was my grandmother's gift when I was a 10-year-old boy that led me to this stage today and led me to write my adult book, Manhunt, The 12-Day Chase for Lincoln's Killer, and then the young adult version, Chasing Lincoln's Killer. And I think that's a good example for children today, that you never know where your life's passion is going to come from or where your interests are going to come from. And something you're interested in today could very well be what you do later in life. Having decided to do the adult book, Manhunt, I struggled with how to write it because it's a true story, and therefore every one of you knows how that story ends, even before I start writing the book. I felt it was like writing a book about the Titanic, the ocean liner that sank after it hit the iceberg. How can you write a book about that that's exciting when everybody knows the ship sank? You all know Abraham Lincoln was president, that John Wilkes Booth, the actor, assassinated him. So how to make that interesting? And I decided to adopt a few techniques. One was try to write it like a novel, all true, but withhold from you key facts until they actually happened in the real timeline. I really wanted to bring the reader back in time so you'd feel like you were reading a newspaper the week Lincoln died, or a magazine article, and to try to persuade you to at least pretend that you don't know the end of the story. So you'd be in a state of suspense or disbelief. A couple of the other methods I used, and these I think are so important for children to think about. I can't write a book just by looking at photocopies and manuscripts and computer images. I need to see the original artifacts, and I need to go to the places. And I think it's so important for kids today to not just read about the Civil War, but go to Gettysburg, go to Antietam, go to the Civil War museums, go to the places Lincoln visited when he was alive in Washington, D.C. There is no substitute to going to where something happened. I remember when I was working on the Manhunt manuscript, I must have gone to Ford's Theater 50 times, sat down and just looked up at the box and tried to imagine what it must have sounded like that night, what could have happened that night. I did the same thing when I would go to the Peterson house, and I would go to the room where Abraham Lincoln had died. And sometimes when you go to that room, no one is there. You can be the only person in the room where Abraham Lincoln died. And I would go there a number of times and imagine what it must have been like through the night as the members of the cabinet, the Lincoln family and friends came to visit Lincoln at his deathbed. And so school is not enough. And reading is vitally important, but reading is not enough. I would say to any child in the audience who's interested in history, beg your parents to take you to the places where these things happened. Because then once you've read about them and then you see them, it can really come alive. And my wife and I certainly do that with our boys. We take them to Gettysburg, we take them to climb on the rocks of Devil's Den, we take them to Little Round Top, to colonial American forts in New York. And that's what my father and my mom did when I was a boy. I remember my first trip to Gettysburg when I was 10 years old. And I can trace all my childhood experiences, getting that gift from my grandmother, going to the Civil War battlefields when I was a child, to what I'm doing today. And kids can really find their destiny by visiting America's great places. This is my first young adult book, as I said. And I really didn't know how to do it. I thought, and my editor from Scholastic, Andrea Pinckney, is here, and this might surprise her, I thought this would be easy. I thought, I'll just reduce the adult book in length and I'll knock it out like that. It was not easy at all. It was very difficult to do, to reduce a 140,000 word book into a 30,000 word book. And I really had to write a new book. I just couldn't cut and trim Manhunt. And since I'd never done this before, I really didn't know how to write for young adults. And so one thing I did was to get help from young people on how to do this. And I had a couple funny experiences with this. After I'd written Manhunt, but while I was writing Chasing Lincoln's Killer, my sister's daughter's elementary school asked me to come and speak to a third grade class. And there were about 30 kids in the audience, and they knew this was my first time writing for them, and this was the very first time I ever spoke to a group of children about my writing. And they wanted to help me, so they had prepared a big poster, hand-lettered, to give me tips on how to write for children. The first tip said, "No foul language," which was fine because my books are not filled with profanity or cursing, so there's nothing I had to remove from the book. Tip 2 was my favorite. And tip 2 was, and I'm quoting this exactly, I'm not paraphrasing it, "Keep in all blood and gore, but not so much that our parents flip out." And the children were great. We talked about writing and what they look for in books and what excites them. But the strangest experience turned out to be a very bright 8-year-old girl who was sitting in the front row, a friend of my niece's. And she asked questions, and she was attentive, and I identified her as probably one of the brighter students in the class. Then the children sent letters to me after my presentation, and my sister delivered them to me. And this girl had written a letter. And it said, and remember, she's 8. "Dear Mr. Swanson, thank you for visiting our class. I dare say you seem to enjoy your time with us." And this was the frightening part. I've had wonderful experiences with readers at all my signings and interviews and appearances, and I really enjoy meeting fellow readers, and I've never had a bad experience. Some of my friends who write novels have had people who follow them and try to contact them, but that's never happened to me, and I like meeting readers always, but I thought this girl might be a problem, because then her letter said, "I felt I gained insights into your personalities," plural, personalities, "while staring into your right eye as you spoke." About a year later, I was at my niece's birthday party in Illinois, and that girl was there. And I said to my sister, "That's that kid." But I had a chat with the girl, and she said she was not involved in any way with witchcraft or voodoo or anything like that. I also asked a couple other kids, our boys, about this, and our eldest had read the adult version of Manhunt when he was 9 years old to give me tips on how to adapt it for children. And then our younger boy also read it and suggested that certain words be changed, like he suggested that the word conspirator might be changed to henchman, that a child might enjoy or understand better. And I said, "What's the most important thing to have in the book?" And they knew about the Booth knife and the attack on Major Rathbone and the attack on Secretary of State Seward. So both boys screamed out to me, "Knives and lots of blood." And so it reminded me of another important point, and I discussed this with my editor, Andrea, at Scholastic. This book did not have to be dumbed down for children. We were in agreement that the true history of these events should be told to the children, and we shouldn't try to sanitize it or make it prettier or less violent than it was, because what John Wilkes Booth did was a terrible thing, and certainly Abraham Lincoln is the hero of my book, not John Wilkes Booth. And so I certainly want the readers to get in the saddle and ride along with Booth on this incredible tale of the chase. But I never want the readers to identify with Booth as the hero, because Abraham Lincoln was certainly, I think, not only our greatest president, but our best American ever. And so I hope you'll feel by the time you get to the end of the book that Abraham Lincoln is really the great hero of the story. There are certain other things that I hope children will learn from the book that is about more than just Abraham Lincoln in this particular story of his death and the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln, I think, is the best example in American history of what reading can do for a person. Think of Lincoln. Grew up absolutely poor. His first log cabin didn't even have proper walls. It was like an outdoor structure, open to the weather at one end. Lincoln endured a childhood of brutal physical labor. By the time he was 9 years old, his father had put a man's axe in his hands and was teaching him how to chop trees and split rails. Lincoln worked day to night. His mother died young. A sister died. He had nothing. Some people in politics over the past many years have tried to compare their origins or their life stories. Completely false. No American politician of the last century has had to endure the harsh and hard upbringing of Abraham Lincoln. Look what Lincoln did by his early love of reading. That's what made him into Abraham Lincoln. His love for books, his love for American history, for Shakespeare, for poetry, for reading the great American legal documents. The books fueled Abraham Lincoln's imagination. And I think it's so important that all children today try to emulate Lincoln's model and read. Young lawyers would often write to Abraham Lincoln when he was practicing law in Illinois in the 1840s and 1850s before he was president, and they would seek his advice. How do I become a lawyer? Where should I go to school? What's the best thing to do? Do I need to move to the big city to practice law where people are more sophisticated? And Lincoln wrote that you can pretty much start wherever you are. And then when someone said, what should I do? What should I read? Lincoln said, simply, my advice is this: get the books and read. And he said, that is what I did, and that is what any of you can do. So I think the most important backstory of any book on Abraham Lincoln, whether it's about the assassination or his life, is to remember the great example of Abraham Lincoln and what he did for himself and the country by learning and by reading. And he did something else that I think is a great lesson for kids, too, who are interested in history or a country's story. Lincoln was a great observer. When he went places, he looked at the buildings, the geography, the people, the stories they told. He loved listening to people's stories. Lincoln had great empathy. If you met Abraham Lincoln, he'd want to know your story, how you grew up, what experiences you've had. He was open to the world, always observing, always taking in information, always wanting to meet people. One of the reasons that Lincoln was a great president was because he had met tens of thousands of people while he practiced law and listened to their stories. He told stories to them. So I think the greatest lesson that kids today should learn from Abraham Lincoln is you really can go on a journey like that through your books, through your reading, by visiting our historic places and museums. Lincoln would certainly say, school's not enough, do all the things that I did too. And I think with that, there's about 10 minutes left. I want to leave time now for questions. So I'll stop now so I can talk to any of you who would like to ask me anything about the books or about Abraham Lincoln. I can't hear you.
It's on now. Hi, I'm Chris Rose. I'm a huge fan of yours. I've bought many of your books, and I give them away for gifts to other people.
I can keep my house for another week.
I will keep you, with the money rolling in. I have one question, and I know I'm not a kid, and I won't take too much of your time so kids can ask you questions. But there's a controversy around Stanton's last words, or the words after Lincoln died.
Yes. Now
he belongs to the ages, or now he belongs to the angels. And I'm wondering what your take is on that, if you have any opinion as to what his
yes.
words
I'm
were.
convinced that at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Secretary of War Stanton, one of the great heroes of the American Civil War who hasn't gotten his due, in my next book coming out in April, Bloody Crimes, which is about the chase for Jefferson Davis and the funeral pageant for Lincoln, I hope to restore Secretary of War Stanton to his proper place in American history. I'm convinced that he said, now he belongs to the angels. And certain witnesses there confirm that. Someone didn't believe me, a writer for the New Yorker. So he went on a big investigation, and my friend Doris Goodwin thinks it might be ages, which she wrote in her book. And Doris and I are friends, and we've agreed to disagree on that. He did a 10-page article in the New Yorker investigating this, and in the end he said, it's probably angels. So I think it was that.
Yeah, good. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Oh, yes, you. Okay. The question was, when I would go to Ford's Theater to research the book, would I go alone or with other people? Really both. Sometimes during my lunch hour from work, I would go over there by myself and just sit there. Sometimes I'd go with my girlfriend, now wife. Sometimes I would go with friends. It really varied. I preferred to go alone because that's when I could exclude the outside world or even modern times and pretend that I was back in 1865. So it was really both. But being alone there helped me most with the writing of the book.
I'm just curious, you're very proud of being from the land of Lincoln. I come from Auburn, New York, which is William Seward's hometown, and I was wondering if you came to Auburn to do any of your research.
Well, I didn't do any research in Auburn, New York, Secretary of State, Seward's hometown, but I did go there on the book tour and spent a wonderful couple days at Auburn, New York. It's a little-known historical site because it's not that convenient to get to, but Secretary of State William Seward's home is one of the best historical museums in the country, and it's a great place to go.
I just wanted to ask a quick question about Mary Todd Lincoln and the different stories you get about her mental health and the impact of being in the situation she was in when her husband was shot. Did that trigger it? Obviously, she had some issues before that. You know, could you give me your insight into that?
Well, the question is about who was the real Mary Lincoln. And it's certainly true. She's quite a controversial figure. What to say about Mary Lincoln? I think Mary Lincoln made his rise possible in their early years. She was a very sophisticated, educated, intelligent woman. Abraham Lincoln was quite crude in comparison to her. Not widely read, deeply, but not widely read. He didn't know how to present himself in public. He dressed like a slob. He didn't comb his hair. He said the strangest things at parties and events. Once Lincoln said to her he wanted to dance with her in the worst way. And she later said, "You certainly did that." She helped groom and train him in their early years. But something had gone wrong by the time of the early part or middle part of his presidency. It could have possibly been mental illness. It could have been her serious carriage accident where her head hit the ground and she was unconscious and took several days to recover. But they grew apart during the Civil War. Lincoln was busy. Hundreds of thousands of men were dying. She exhibited an obsession with shopping for the White House or buying 100 pair of gloves at a time or multiple sets of new china, screaming at the wives of Union generals she claimed were attempting to usurp her. Official Washington did snub her. They did not like her. She had few friends in the city. Mary Lincoln was not the pioneering feminist hero ahead of her time that some people try to make her out to be, but she was also not a monster. All I can say is she was somewhere in between. I think the best take on Mary Lincoln is in Michael Burlingame's new 2-volume book on Abraham Lincoln, which is the best of the 60 books that have come out for the Lincoln Bicentennial. Just Abraham Lincoln: A Life by Michael Burlingame. Knows more about Abraham Lincoln than anyone else alive. Has studied Mary more than anyone. And if you want to know more about Mary Lincoln, I'd suggest taking a look at his new book.
I'm also from Illinois, and I was wondering if you think that there's any way to not be obsessed with Lincoln if you come from Illinois, because it's kind of shoved in your face.
Well, even our license plates say Land of Lincoln,
yeah.
which caused my parents some trouble in the 1950s when they drove through Mississippi and Alabama with Land of Lincoln license plates in old town squares. But yeah, we're really inculcated with the Lincoln theme when we're kids. And most high schools have trips that take you to the Lincoln home and other places.
I'm actually from Springfield, so.
Well, it's an Illinois. You know, it's an Illinois tradition if you're from Springfield.
Hi, I'm a huge patron of the Ford's Theater, and I know you said you went there for inspiration. What do you think about the renovation that they've done inside? I know the museum's downstairs, but with the change of the chairs and such.
I think the renovation of Ford's Theater was long overdue. It had been reopened in 1968, but had fallen into disrepair. And first, mechanically, everything had to be fixed and repaired and redone. And thank goodness more comfortable chairs have been put in Ford's Theater, because it is a working theater. And I think it was a good idea to open up the Lincoln story in the Ford's Theater Museum beyond just the assassination. And now the exhibit is about the whole range of Lincoln's life.
I'm from Indiana, where the moral life of the greatest American was formed. And I heard some years ago that Robert Lincoln had burned papers just before he died. There was anything significant about that.
Yes, there is a story that Robert Lincoln had burned certain papers. The letters between Abraham and Mary essentially are non-existent now. So there is a possibility that Robert might have destroyed some of those letters. We don't know exactly what he destroyed. He did have a great sense of privacy about the family life of his parents. So tragically, Robert certainly did destroy some historical documents. Next. All right. Thanks very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.